the important functions of academics is to mentor students and to supervise their projects, dissertations, thesis. The icons performed and are still performing these roles even after retirement.
One of the sacred duties of a lecturer is to be able to guide other students. And I have had experience of producing students at master's, at PhD level, not only here, but also abroad. Students, of course, differ. Some are eager to work. Some would think that you are putting too much on them. But I've always said this, and I believe it very strongly, that when you supervise a student, you tell them that the thesis you are writing now, for you as a supervisor, there's no problem getting it there and passing it and giving you your PhD. But what is important is that 10 years from the date you get your PhD, you are still proud of the thesis you have produced. And this is what I impress on all my students. You have to work hard, get a thesis that you'll be proud of years after the thesis had been passed.
I have been a mentor to many. I've played some special role as a teacher to very, very many. One of my students of those 1963 days is now a senior advocate. He's not the only one. So I know that I have, from what they say, that I have played a big part in their lives, and I'm grateful to God because of that. It's in more recent years that I have played the role of a supervisor at postgraduate level. I have supervised a large number of master students and some PhD students as well, both in Kano and in Jos. And I find this a very challenging task indeed, because it requires a lot of reading, a lot of helpful comments. In evaluating students' work, I'm always conscious of the need not to be destructive in one's criticism. One should criticize, but at the same time one should be able to encourage.
At Bayero University, of course, right from the 1976-77 session, I began to supervise undergraduate students, and after my PhD, in fact, 2 years after my PhD, I was given my first PhD student to supervise at Bayero, and he successfully defended his thesis in 1987 with the late Professor K. Williamson as external examiner. Supervision also is a learning process for the supervisor, because your student probably knows more about the subject than you, so you learn from the student. You're participating in the research as a director indirectly, but you end up learning a lot about that subject area and also improving your own research skills.
At home here, of course, we always chose the best to go into research. One unhappy episode in my career, I would say, was having somebody from Zimbabwe sent over to me to do a PhD. And it was clear to me within the first few weeks that really he hadn't got it in him to do a PhD, at least for Ibadan. And I was in great difficulty to let him know this. So it meant, of course, that I applied more effort into supervising him than I would normally have applied in supervising other students. But in the end, I had to give up, and he returned to Zimbabwe without a PhD in Ibadan. I don't know what he thinks, whether he thinks I think he has failed, but he probably thinks I have failed to, to make him do a PhD. Well, I did my best, but that's failure there, all the same, that I didn't manage to get him to do it. Otherwise, things are very nice. I was served on examining panels in various universities, and the standard was very high, and there's nothing really to complain about. So I'm quite happy with what I've been able to do across the board in Nigeria, in most parts of Africa, and even outside Africa.
Research is crucial to the growth and development of university teachers. It is one of the essential roles of academics, tertiary level. Our icons were and are still researchers, focusing on different aspects of English linguistics.
My research focus has been mainly in linguistics, but also tangentially in English. And I will explain how that happened. Now, in linguistics, I started out as a statistician. I did a grammar of Yoruba based on modern linguistic principles. But when I got back to Nigeria and I had to teach, I saw that there were a number of areas that I had to go into. I had to examine the orthography of the Yoruba language and see what improvements could be made. I had to teach courses on Fagunwa, which is literature, which was a little outside the language thing, which I had been doing. Then I had to move into the area of sociolinguistics, talking about language in society, language planning, language use, all those areas I had to go into. Language in education, all those are areas in which I moved into as well. Now, as for the English language, because of my training in language, I was involved from the very beginning. I was involved in the Ford Foundation, the Ford Foundation survey, language survey, English language survey, which was it was sponsored by the Ford Foundation, and we went through looking at the teaching of English in various secondary schools, and this increased my interest in the need to do something about the teaching of English in Nigeria. When the Nigeria English Studies Association, NISA, was formed, Nigeria English Studies Association, NISA, was formed in 1965 in Jos, I was one of the founding members. And so the Journal of English Studies, the NISA journal, that journal I contributed a lot to. Now within English properly, I looked at English in Nigeria, the publication by John Spencer, English in West Africa, 1971. I made an important contribution on English language in Nigeria. I wrote on registers of English to show people that when you use English, it's not a monolithic thing. You have different registers that you use according to who is speaking, what the subject is, what the occasion is. Then I moved into areas of which other people have worked on, Brosnan, Ayobanjo, on varieties of English and how this could be correlated to what would be the standard to be used in teaching English. Then I veered into area of codification. That is important to codify all these things that we are doing. And of course, there is the problem of what is an error, what is an innovation, which I believe is important to look at some point.
The program that confronted Nigerian linguists who were entering the business in the 1960s was that of making an impact on the language situation in the country and the place of the English language within that situation. At the time that I began in the English department here, one way that we thought we could help the situation was by developing contrastive studies. People had done it before me, Tomori, Afolayan, and I decided that I was going to do a contrastive study of aspects of the syntax of English and Yoruba. That was what I worked on for my PhD. It is an interest which has become abiding all my career. And within the English language part of that thesis, I've been part of people who are trying to say, okay, there's a kind of chaotic scene in the English language. How do we do it? Because I assume, well, yeah, I did assume in my PhD thesis that when Nigerians spoke English that was different from standard British English, they were making mistakes, there were errors. But we developed along and we wanted to see whether a principled distinction could be made between deviance and deviation. Deviance would be explained in terms of errors, but deviation would be legitimate differences between Nigerian English and the standard English of other places. So once we've done this, we then say, okay, if there is a principled distinction to be made between deviance and deviations, how do we make this distinction? And many of us went to work on this to try and see, okay, what kinds of English are spoken in Nigeria. The man who started this off from this department was a man called Brosnahan in 1958. He described English in southern Nigeria, and I built on that. And there's this question of varieties of English in the country, and other people have joined in. Professor Bangbushe has published on the matter. David Jawit has published on the matter. He introduced the idea of popular Nigerian English, into which everybody dips to arrive at as a standard variation. And a very important research work was done by Munzali Jibril, who concentrated on the phonology and brought this perspective of, first of all, talking about the well, let me use my own language, the elite Northern English, the ordinary Northern English, and then the elite Southern English and the ordinary. And he thinks, and I hope, that there may in course of time be a convergence between the Northern elite English and the Southern elite English to give us the national elite English. Mind you, it doesn't mean that everybody will then speak in the same way in the country. I agree with Munzali that even when we do arrive at this happy situation where everybody is able to speak intelligible English, and by I mean intelligible across the globe. Even after that has been done, there will still be phonetic differences between Northern English and Southern English. Just as we say we are developing a Nigerian standard English, I'm sure that anyone who listens to us and finds that maybe the sort of English we speak is internationally intelligible, they will also be able to decide that there's something Nigerian about the way that this person speaks English. So we don't want to become black Englishmen, as this was the accusation at one time. There's no such thing. When everybody speaks what we call good English, acceptable English, you still be able to tell. But even now, people who speak that variety of English, if it's Igbo, you will notice certain things, certain markers. And Yoruba, that is pride. That we don't want to rule out our nationality or our cultural peculiarities. But we do want to communicate intelligibly across the globe. And we want to speak in a way which is acceptable to our fellow Nigerians. So these are the two parameters that I worked with: international intelligibility, social acceptability. And on the basis of this, one has been trying to recommend a variety of English which passes both tests. So we've been on that. We came close to giving effect and relevance to this kind of research when we were invited to join the International Corpus of English. And we thought with that we would get a file, will correspond all over the country with other scholars, and then we'll have a bank of the sort of English spoken in Nigeria, so that, and that was my hope at that time, so that future researchers into English would have a bank to go into for examples, for data that they need for their work. Unfortunately, the ICE thing fell through. It's a very, very bad development. I'm very sorry that we missed that opportunity. But even if, because this was going to be published, this was a worldwide project, and we failed to keep up with the timelines. But I think we should continue to build this bank so that future researchers into the English language in Nigeria would have somewhere to go to and get data. That is still not too late.
I don't want to be immodest, but anyone familiar with my work would know that my major contribution has been in the area of the description of Nigerian spoken English. I would say that until I came to carry out research in that area, it was as if people were avoiding it, because it was easier to do the written, to analyze Nigerian written English and so on. So because of the difficulty and the complexity of phonological analysis, people were avoiding that area. But thank God I was able to at least scratch the surface of it, in terms of at least developing a framework for describing Nigerian English accent. Because you see, in the end, what you're talking about Yoruba English, Hausa English, Igbo English, Efik English, Ibibio English, Tiv English, and so on. But this is also a speech community that is on a daily basis interacting with one another, members of which are interacting with one another. So, and there is such a thing as Nigerian English, which is distinct from, say, Ghanaian English or Gambian English or Australian English. So how do you define that? I think the framework that I developed for defining and describing Nigerian spoken English is one of my contributions to knowledge. Well, there are areas that I only scratched the surface of, like the rhythm, the intonation of Nigerian English. Well, I don't have any regrets there, because you see, with all the research done on English intonation, any honest specialist will tell you that they've only scratched the surface of that as well. So even native English intonation has not been fully described, not to talk of a more complex one, which is second language English intonation, where you have the intonation system of some of the native languages coming in and being superimposed on the English language.
My great field of interest is the Nigerian variety of English, Nigerian English. Up till today, I, and I expect other people, have to tell the world that when we speak of Nigerian English, we do not mean Pidgin English or Nigerian Pidgin. The two things are different, even though there's a lot of influence of Pidgin on Nigerian English. I mentioned earlier my book on the subject, Nigerian English Usage, which was published by Longman in 1991, and which I know has been much quoted, much used ever since then. But as with any book, as the years passed, I recognized certain inadequacies, limitations in it, and therefore, about a year ago, I started writing a new book on the subject, to be called Nigerian English, which was commissioned by a distinguished company of linguistics books outside the country called De Gruyter Mouton, who are based in New York and Berlin. And it's published in a series that they have called Dialects of English, in which you find summaries of various varieties of English. Indian English is there, Singaporean English, American English as well, both native speaker and non-native speaker varieties.
Linguists and non-linguists have been passionate about the possible death of African languages due to the imposing position occupied by English in some African countries, such as Nigeria. The icons of English studies opined that there is a need to raise the esteem of African and Nigerian languages, especially.
Well, the fact that the English language is the official language in Nigeria and the language that is used for education beyond lower primary has made the status of Nigerian languages very low, up to the point that in the schools, fee-paying nursery and primary schools, the teaching is mainly, in fact, it's entirely in English. But we do know that if children are taught in their language at the beginning, it makes for better development of concepts. And so the way out, it seems to me, is to ensure that we begin the child's education in his or her own language before moving on to English as a medium of instruction. That would increase the prestige of Nigerian and African languages and would even make for better students who are better in terms of concept formation.
The best way to develop a country is through the mother tongue. We have lost that opportunity, or maybe we never really had the opportunity, because things have moved so far in the Western world, and things have been imported into our country, and we have been given the impression that unless we use English, we cannot do algebra, we cannot do medicine, we cannot do anything. Now, this certainly is not true. And the body of linguists have been working on this, working on meta-language, working on vocabularies of the relevant disciplines, so that African languages can be used, in fact, for teaching and research. It's not going to be easy, but it can be done. And when it is done, we will find that people at all levels learn more easily than they are doing at the moment. To be realistic, the English language would have to make a contribution, because that's the way we can have access to what other people have done or are doing. And it's important for us to be aware of this.
I've written some papers where I raised the alarm that we are in danger of losing our languages. Not just the minority languages, small languages, which are already disappearing anyway, but even the ones that we think are major and are secure, they are not. That is to say, Hausa, Yoruba, and Igbo. They are not. Increasingly now, there are, especially in the big cities, Nigerian children who don't speak any Nigerian language. So it's very unfortunate. And what this means is that they themselves will not be in a position to speak any Nigerian language to their own children. And so by the time you've had, if it goes on a large scale, and you have 2-3 generations, you'll have somebody with a Yoruba name, I'm Funsho Adebanjo. But yeah, are you Yoruba? Well, my grandfather was Yoruba, but I don't speak the language. That's what's going to happen. In about 100 years, we'll have people bearing Yoruba names who don't speak the language, and Hausa names don't speak the language. Hopefully, this could be slowed down because there are push and pull factors. When you look at also the digital culture, the satellite television, and the possibility that you could have satellite television stations broadcasting from the US in Yoruba, for example, 24 hours, beaming their broadcasts to mainly the Nigerian audience, that could slow down, the journey of Yoruba towards extinction.
Here in Nigeria, we have over 500 languages, and undoubtedly, many of them are facing extinction. If we don't want them to become extinct, how are we going to prevent it? Well, undoubtedly, we have to make sure that they are spoken and used. But if you have only 100 people left in a village, say, who speak that language, and most of them are elderly, and the young ones don't know the language, what do you do? To be realistic, you just have to admit that this language is going to die. A very sad development, but I just think it's unavoidable.
The standardization and codification of Nigerian English is still not well defined. The problems of standardization and codification remain unresolved. The icon spoke on this crucial issue.
Well, I think the important question is, why do you have standardization? Standardization doesn't arise only in situations where a language is spoken as a second language. There is standardization, there has been standardization in England, and that's what people refer to as Queen's English. And not everybody in England speaks Queen's English or Oxford English. There are varieties of the language everywhere. But there has to be a standard. And I think it was Randolph Quirk, the professor in London University and later Vice Chancellor of the university, who says that the standard English is the one which draws the least attention to itself. In other words, it doesn't tell you your provenance. It doesn't tell you you are Scottish, or you are Welsh, or you are from London itself. Because the local peculiarities, local features have been so much reduced that what is left makes for intelligibility. That's where standardization and intelligibility come in. And over the centuries in Britain, this is what is taught in the best grammar schools. So they are the elite. They're supposed to come out and influence the way that the rest of the country speaks. And there is a reason why the spoken version, the spoken standard, is referred to as received pronunciation. It means that it's not pronunciation you are born with. People go to school and receive the standard pronunciation. And so we must be very clear about that. The situation becomes complex where you are dealing with the language. In a second language situation, nobody speaks it naturally. And people pick it up in all kinds of circumstances. And if we are going to communicate with one another within the country, we need something which makes us shed perhaps some of the features of the mother tongue, the transfers that are made into the English language. So we have to be very careful about that, to know that the reason why we are standardizing in the second language situation is that within the country itself, we need to be able to communicate with each other. Otherwise, if you take somebody who speaks a product of primary school from Abakaliki, and you ask him to speak with a product of primary school from Sokoto or somewhere, I don't think they'll be able to communicate. They just won't be able to understand what each other was saying. So we need that internally. But even more importantly, we need it internationally. That when Nigerians have acquired the standard, the Nigerian standard, it will be gold standard for the rest of the world. That anyone who is satisfied as speaking standard Nigerian English should go anywhere in the world and speak English. With the least, they will know he's an African, but that won't disturb what he's saying. So that is the reason why we say we need to produce a standard. Now, efforts are being made. Of course, dictionary making is very important to that, because that's the way to standardize. If you don't know the meaning of a word in English, you go to the dictionary, and the dictionary gives you what is the accepted standard meaning of that word. They even now give you help in pronunciation, and you know this is the correct way to pronounce. That's the standard way. Now, in our situation, all kinds of ways, as I said, have produced a medley of ways of speaking English. And it seems to me proper that if you put children to school and they do primary school and they do secondary school without even now talking about the university, they will have spent about 10, 12 years of their lives learning English. And if there is no surrender value at the end of that period, they still can't communicate with anybody in the world who speaks English or cannot be understood. They are not intelligible to other people. Then we've been wasting our efforts, surely, because there's enough time to make every product of the secondary school, not to talk of the university. Well, the problem that Brosnahan had was he was just equating mechanically standards with attainment educationally. It's not so mechanical. But that's a truth in this, that if you invest so much in the learning, in the teaching and learning of English language, at the end of it, you must be able to produce something. And we are not, at the moment, we are not doing that. So the dictionary project is important. The important thing now is we have to find out, because somebody has to exercise judgment. If you say this is standard Nigerian usage, you must be able to answer the question, why? Why do you say so? Is it just your own individual feeling about the subject, or has there been a panel of linguists who have passed each one of these things? Now, NISA has the advantage that it contains English language specialists, and one hopes that every item that goes into the dictionary has been vetted so that there's nothing idiosyncratic about any of them. Once this is done, then we are okay. Because the English language is still used in different kinds of contexts. You don't only use it in universities or even in commercial transactions internationally. You use it in literature. And writers deliberately use non-standard, either to appeal to the culture that they are talking about, or to refer to the educational level of the person who's being made to speak in a particular way. So all that is there, but the dictionary has to be based on proper vetting, and it has to be an ongoing thing. The Oxford English Dictionary is revised every so many years, and additions are made, corrections are made, and we must be very sure that once we put a dictionary in the hands of Nigerians, that whatever they look at there represents the standard, because you don't make it, well, if you want to, you can make it a dictionary of substandard English, but I don't see why anyone would want to do that. Now, the important thing in the whole business of standardization is you ask yourself, what kind of English should you teach in schools? The whole thing is intertwined, because you have teachers all over the country, and they must have some guidance on what should be acceptable in examinations. The examinations council particularly, they need to know. Let me take a trivial example, orthography. You want the examiners either to accept or reject FLAVOR for flavor, or they must insist on FLAVOUR, and honor, HONOR, and so on. Now, these items are standard in America, but they happen not to be standard in England. Now, what does Nigeria say about the matter? You see, because the English language situation is getting more and more complex. America is more or less dominating English. And many users of English in England are tending towards accepting what is used in America because of the commercial power of America, the influence of Hollywood, and so on and so forth. But I do not think that any English boy writing his O levels or A levels and spelling honor as HONOR would be accepted. In America, that's all right. So we must evolve a standard which would equally be respected. But what at the beginning, what some of us said was, it's all right, we must pay attention to the fact that America is now influencing the English language in very important ways. But if you accept the American spelling from a candidate, then you must expect that candidate to be consistent. He will not write flavor without you in one sentence and then come and write with you in another. It means that there's no idea of standardization. That's why we must accept. Some people say, it's all right, as I've just said, why don't you accept honor and HONOR? This is acceptable in America. It's acceptable, but America does not accept HONOUR. So consistency comes into the matter. And once we decide, and it's there in the dictionary, there's no way that you won't have to confront this problem. Your entries, are you going to put honor without you or with you? And the fact that you put it or you don't put it means that you are making a statement on standard Nigerian usage.
The expression standard Nigerian English has been used a lot in the last 50 years even, but I think that there are big problems yet in achieving the kind of standardization that we want, especially because what is needed is a standard dictionary, that is one that really has official approval, the approval of a very large number of scholars in this country. And part of the problem is deciding what counts as standard and what does not. If I can give an example, in recent years I've become aware that people use the word severally, the adverb severally, meaning simply several times. But if you look it up in a dictionary such as the Advanced Learner's Dictionary, you will find that severally in fact means separately, one by one. So are we going to say that severally should be regarded, severally meaning several times, should be regarded as standard Nigerian English? But if so, who is it who's going to give that kind of imprimatur, so to say, on it? Well, this is a question not yet resolved.
Codification is a major issue in standardization. And before we can accept any usage, any word, any lexical item as being codified, there must be some general agreement. Many of the books coming out showing this is authentic Nigerian English. If you look at some of the earlier publications like Kujore, like Jawit, you'll find that they will be regarded there as non-standard. So we need to go ahead from individuals prescribing to a body that can help us to agree on the forms which we'll regard as being standard. We almost did this with the West African Linguistic Society, which had a working group on English language in West Africa, but we didn't go far. Under NISA too, there was the ICE project, which again was to have done something like this, but we did not work out. I think every effort is to be praised in this regard, but we still need coordination. It's similar to what we did when we were working out meta language for Yoruba. Each university was doing something different, but we had to come together to do a joint thing, which then became accepted by everybody.
So the codification has started not only from the dictionaries, but from the descriptive works of scholars. You know, like Adesanwoye, you know, even Professor Banjo himself, and so on. So some of these descriptive works actually identify, you know, parameters that could be used in codifying.